The sound of tires screeching against the frozen asphalt shattered the silence of the empty road. Henry Whitmore's heart slammed into his chest as his hands gripped the wheel, knuckles turning white. The servo had come out of nowhere, a flash of antlers and dark eyes illuminated by the beams of his luxury car's headlights. Instinctively, Henry yanked the steering wheel to the right for a split second. He thought he had avoided the animal. But the victory was short-lived. The world spun. The car careened across the icy road like a marionette without strings. Henry shouted, a useless plea, as the tires lost their grip. His stomach lurched as the car tilted, its weight pulling it toward the edge of the embankment. The snow blurred into streaks of white. Branches scraped the sides of the car like claws, snapping and splintering as the vehicle barreled down the slope. With a jolt, the car collided against a thick bank of snow. The impact threw Henry forward, his chest slamming into the steering wheel. He gasped, a sharp pain stabbing his ribs as silence fell over everything. A ringing echoed in his ears, drowning out the world. For a moment, there was nothing but the white haze outside the cracked windshield. Snowflakes swirled like ghosts under the silver light of the moon. Henry's breaths came shallow and fast, fogging the air before him. Pain crept in slowly. His left leg throbbed mercilessly, pinned awkwardly against the console. When he reached down, he felt something warm on his pants. Blood. The cold seeped in through the broken windows, biting his skin like tiny needles. Henry shivered uncontrollably. He pushed weakly at the door, but it didn't budge. The car was wedged too deeply into the snow. His hands trembled as he fumbled for his phone. He lifted it high, praying for a signal. Nothing. Just the mocking, empty bars. Henry slumped back into his seat, the reality of his situation crashing over him like an avalanche. He was trapped. Alone. The snowstorm howled outside, the wind carrying an unforgiving chill that clawed at his face. "Help!" Henry screamed into the void, his voice raw and desperate. Only the wind answered him, a cruel whisper that told him no one would hear. He hit the dashboard with his fist, frustration bubbling inside him. What good was his wealth now? The millions he had spent decades amassing, the mansions, the investments, the cars. None of it could save him from this moment. As the minutes dragged on, Henry's thoughts turned dark. He had spent so much of his life alone, climbing a ladder that led to nothing but an empty house and empty days. The money was supposed to buy happiness, but what had it really given him? A name on a Forbes list, a reputation he didn't even care to defend. Here he was now, reduced to a helpless man, bleeding in the snow. A sob escaped his lips, unbidden. The cold was unbearable. He looked through the cracked glass and saw the snowflakes, falling in an endless spiral, as if the heavens themselves had decided to bury him. His chest rose and fell in shuddering breaths. "Please," he whispered into the darkness, his voice cracking. "Please, God, help me. I don't want to die here, not like this." Henry closed his eyes and rested his head against the seat. He tried to imagine warmth, his mother's hand on his forehead when he was a boy, the crackle of a fire, the feeling of sun on his face, anything to pull him away from the present. Then, just as his mind began to slip into unconsciousness, he heard it, a sound faint and distant, a bark. Henry's eyes shot open. At first he thought he had imagined it, a cruel trick of his failing mind, but there it was again. Closer this time, the unmistakable sound of a dog barking. He turned his head weakly toward the window, squinting through the frost. In the storm, he could see nothing but whirling snow. The barking grew louder, cutting through the howling wind. Was it possible? Could someone have found him? The barking stopped. Henry's heart pounded as he strained to listen. Seconds passed like hours. Then came a thud, a soft, deliberate sound against the outside of the car. Henry held his breath from the corner of his eye. He saw movement. The snowstorm roared like a living beast, whipping icy tendrils across the empty landscape amid the swirling chaos. Max, a German shepherd with matted fur and a gaunt frame, trudged through the snow, each step heavy and deliberate. He wasn't just a dog, he was a survivor. For as long as he could remember, his days had been spent scavenging scraps and avoiding the harsh hands of strangers. Abandoned long ago, the streets and forests had become his world. But tonight was different. The wind carried something unusual, faint but unmistakable. The sharp scent of gasoline, the metallic tang of blood. Max's ears pricked forward and his nose twitched. He stopped in his tracks, eyes scanning the white void, before moving with renewed purpose. Instinct urged him onward, guiding him through the knee-deep snow toward the source of the strange smell. After what felt like an eternity, Max found it. A car, torn, broken and partially buried in a drift of snow at the bottom of the embankment. The headlights flickered weakly, their light struggling against the storm. Max approached cautiously, his paws sinking with each step. His nose led him to the shattered passenger side window, where the scent of blood was strongest. Inside, he saw a man. Henry Whitmore sat slumped against the wheel, his breath slow and shallow. Max cocked his head, staring intently at the figure. The man looked lifeless, pale against the growing frost that crept along the edges of the car. Max let out a soft whine, as if the sound might rouse him, but Henry remained still. The dog barked once, a deep, sharp sound that echoed into the night. Nothing. Max's instincts flared like a fire. He knew the man was alive, but fading. He had seen creatures in this state before, both man and beast, and he knew what happened when help didn't come. Something inside him, the part that refused to give up on survival, spurred him into action. With his powerful frame, Max jumped up, placing his paws against the window. Shards of glass bit into his pads, but he paid no mind. He squeezed his head through the broken opening and reached for Henry. Nudging the man's shoulder with his nose, Henry groaned faintly, a whisper of life that sent Max's tail flicking. The man was still there, still alive. Max pulled back, pacing around the car, assessing. He needed to get Henry out. But how? His gaze fell on the man's coat, a heavy wool fabric that had bunched against his chest. Max leapt back into the car, clamping his teeth around the edge of the coat with the gentleness of a creature that knew how to protect. He pulled. The fabric held fast, stuck beneath Henry's weight. Max growled low in his throat, anchoring himself with his paws as he yanked again. The coat shifted slightly. Just enough to give him hope. He adjusted his grip, his jaws firm, and pulled with everything he had. Henry stirred, his eyelids fluttering as the motion jostled him. The sound of fabric tearing ripped through the stillness. The coat split at the seams, a section of it tearing free with a loud snap. Max stumbled back, the torn piece dangling from his mouth. Blood smeared the edges, stark against the snow as the wind threatened to snatch it away. He stared at the man one last time, his dark eyes filled with a quiet promise. Then, as if understanding that he could do no more alone, Max turned and bolted through the snow. The storm had worsened. The wind screeched and the snow blinded, but Max ran as if he could see the path clear as day. The piece of fabric flapped against his jaws, a beacon of urgency as he pushed through the drifts. His muscles burned, his breath fogged the air, but he didn't stop. Miles passed like minutes, miles. At last, Max emerged onto the highway, where the snow had flattened under the few tires that dared brave the storm. The road stretched on, empty and silent. Max planted himself in the middle of the lane, barking loudly, insistently, his voice carrying into the abyss. Nothing. His heart, if dogs could carry such despair, sank. But he didn't stop. Max barked again, louder this time, shaking the piece of fabric violently. His eyes darted left and right as he scanned for movement. The blood-stained cloth flared against the wind, a flag of desperation, as he barked over and over, refusing to give up. Then, far in the distance, a faint glow appeared. Max froze, his ears tilting forward. The light grew brighter, cutting through the storm like a promise. A truck rumbled into view, its headlights reflecting off the snow. The truck slowed as it approached the barking figure in the road. Inside, Joe Miller, a weary trucker with decades of experience behind the wheel, squinted at the scene before him. A dog, soaked and trembling, stood defiantly in the snow, barking and holding something ragged in its mouth. "What the hell?" Joe muttered, pulling the truck to a stop. He opened the door and stepped down, boots crunching in the frost. "What's got you all worked up?" "Boy." Max dropped the fabric, barking at Joe with frantic intensity. He took a step back, then turned toward the embankment, looking over his shoulder as if to say, "Follow me." Joe frowned, glancing at the bloody scrap. "Is that—" Realization struck like lightning. Without another word, he grabbed his flashlight and jogged after Max, who led the way through the snow as fast as his tired legs could carry him. Down the embankment, the beams of Joe's flashlight swept over the wrecked car, illuminating the crumpled metal and shattered glass. "Oh, God," Joe whispered, his voice catching. He raced to the driver's side, shining the light through the window to see Henry slumped, unmoving. "Hang on, sir, help's coming," Joe shouted as he pulled out his phone, dialing emergency services with trembling hands. Max stood a few feet away, watching silently, his chest rising and falling with exhaustion. As the sound of sirens approached in the distance, Joe crouched next to the dog, resting a hand on his head. "You saved him, boy, you really did." Max let out a tired sigh, his tail thumping faintly against the snow. He had done what he set out to do. Now, it was up to the humans. The wail of approaching sirens sliced through the wind, growing louder with each passing second. The snowstorm still raged, but its fury was no match for the urgent voices and the bright spinning lights of the emergency vehicles that arrived at the scene. Joe waved frantically from the base of the embankment, his flashlight cutting arcs through the darkness. "Down here, he's down here." The paramedics rushed down the slippery slope. Carrying their equipment, Max sat a few feet away from the crumpled car, his eyes never leaving the unconscious man inside. His fur was soaked, his body shivering, but he refused to move. The red and blue lights reflected in his dark eyes as if he were a sentinel guarding a treasure. The first paramedic to reach the wreck peered through the broken windshield. His breath-catching Henry Whitmore, wealthy, powerful, yet now small and fragile, was barely clinging to life. "He's alive," the paramedic confirmed, his voice tight with urgency. "We need to get him out of there now." The team sprang into action, cutting through the twisted metal with tools that screamed against the quiet of the storm. Max flinched at the noise but stayed put, watching their every move. A paramedic noticed the German Shepherd, its coat matted with ice and snow, and the blood-stained scrap of fabric still nearby. He frowned, bending down to speak softly to the dog. "Easy, boy, it's okay, we've got him now." But Max didn't respond to comfort or orders. He stood firm, his paws planted in the snow as if silently commanding them to finish what he had started. Only when they finally pulled Henry from the car, cradling him onto a stretcher, did Max take a step back. His breath came in heavy puffs as he watched them carefully load the old man into the ambulance. As the back door slammed shut, Joe turned toward the dog, admiration etched into his face. "You're something else, you know that." He crouched down, extending a hand. "Come on, let's get you somewhere warm." Max hesitated, glancing once more at the now empty car before following Joe up the embankment. Henry awoke hours later to the beeping of machines and the muted hum of hospital life. Bright white walls greeted him, harsh against his tired eyes. He blinked, feeling the weight of his body, the ache in his leg, and the faint tug of an IV needle in his arm. He was alive. A nurse noticed him stirring and approached with a soft smile. "Welcome back, Mr. Whitmore. You gave us all quite a scare." Henry's voice came out hoarse, a weak whisper. "What happened?" "You were in an accident, a bad one." She adjusted his blanket, her tone kind but professional. "But you were lucky. Someone found you in time." Henry frowned, trying to remember. The storm, the crash, the dog. His mind flashed with the image of dark eyes staring at him through the snow. "The dog," he croaked. The nurse paused, surprise flickering across her face. "So you remember him?" Henry blinked, confused. "Who?" "The dog. He saved you," she said softly, as if it were the most obvious truth in the world. "A German Shepherd. He ran onto the highway with a piece of your coat if he hadn't caught the attention of that trucker." She didn't finish the sentence, but Henry understood what she meant. His throat tightened. A dog. A stray, by the sound of it. Henry had spent his life believing the world was transactional, that people acted only when there was something to gain. Yet here was a creature who had risked its life for him, a stranger. The weight of it sat heavy on his chest. "Where is he?" Henry asked suddenly, his voice stronger now. The nurse looked uncertain. "The dog. Oh, he's safe. Don't worry. He was brought in with you, soaking wet and exhausted. The animal shelter picked him up earlier this morning. They said he was underweight and worn out, but he'll be okay." Henry's gaze fixed on the ceiling, his thoughts whirling. The nurse moved to check his monitors, leaving him alone with his memories. He closed his eyes, seeing flashes of the storm, the car, and then that dog. his fierce determination, his quiet strength. The nurse returned a few minutes later with a man Henry recognized as the doctor overseeing his care. The doctor carried something in his hand, a plastic evidence bag. Inside was a torn scrap of Henry's coat, stained with blood. "This is what the dog used to get someone's attention," the doctor said, placing the bag gently on Henry's bedside table. "Incredible, isn't it?" Henry stared at the fragment of fabric, his vision blurring. He could still feel the cold, the hopelessness, the certainty that his life was ending. But this torn piece of himself, had been enough to save him. A dog had done this. Not for reward or recognition, just because it was the right thing to do. "Where did they take him?" Henry asked, his voice firm now. "To the county shelter." The doctor replied, "They're keeping an eye on him. He was in rough shape, but he'll pull through." Henry nodded faintly, his decision already made. "I want to see him." The doctor raised an eyebrow. "That's not necessary, he's just a stray." Henry cut him off, his tone sharp for the first time. "No, he's not just a stray. That dog saved my life. I need to see him." The doctor exchanged a glance with the nurse but said nothing more. They knew better than to argue with a man who had just stared death in the face. Henry spent the rest of the day resting, but his mind never quieted. The image of Max haunted him, filling the silence with an urgency he couldn't ignore. For the first time in years, he felt something stir inside him, a pull toward someone, something beyond himself. As the evening fell, the nurse returned to check on him. Henry turned to her, his voice steady. "Can you arrange for me to visit the shelter tomorrow?" Her brows furrowed. "Are you sure you're up for it?" Henry nodded. "I've never been more sure of anything." The shelter sat at the edge of town, surrounded by a chain-link fence dusted with snow. The sign above the gate, weathered and faded, read County Animal Rescue. Inside, the air carried the faint scent of antiseptic and wet fur, a stark contrast to the sterile hospital Henry had left hours ago, for a man who had spent decades surrounded by marble floors, chandeliers, and private staff. The shelter felt worlds apart, humble, alive and raw. Henry Whitmore stepped inside, leaning slightly on his cane as his injured leg protested the effort. The soft jingling of tags and muffled barks greeted him. A young shelter worker, dressed in a thick sweater and scuffed boots, approached with a polite but curious expression. "Can I help you, sir?" Henry's face was pale but resolute, his voice steady. "I'm here for the German Shepherd, the one who saved my life." The worker blinked, recognition dawning on her face. "You mean Max? Oh, he's been something of a hero around here." She paused, her voice softening. "He's in the back. He's been resting. He was pretty worn out when they brought him in. Follow me." The corridor was narrow and dimly lit, the walls lined with chain-link enclosures. Dogs of all shapes and sizes pressed against the fences as they passed, tails wagging, voices barking, pleading for attention. But Henry's focus was fixed. The rhythmic tap of his cane on the concrete floor echoed as they walked, until the worker stopped before a kennel near the end of the row. Inside, lying curled on a thin blanket, was Max. His fur, though still unkempt, looked cleaner now, and his ears perked slightly at the sound of footsteps. Slowly, Max lifted his head, his dark eyes meeting Henry's through the chain-link barrier. For a moment, neither moved. Henry gripped his cane tighter as a lump formed in his throat. "There he is," the worker said gently. "He's been quiet since he got here, but he's tough. You can go in if you'd like." Henry nodded faintly, and the worker unlocked the gate, stepping aside as he entered. Henry moved carefully, lowering himself onto a small wooden bench just inside the kennel. Max remained still, watching him, studying him, as if trying to remember who this man truly was. "Hey there," Henry said softly, his voice cracking with an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. "It's me." Max tilted his head, those eyes, intelligent, unyielding, searching Henry's face. Then, slowly, the dog pushed himself to his feet. Henry's heart pounded as Max stepped forward, his paws pressing lightly into the concrete. The space between them closed until Max's nose gently touched Henry's hand. Henry let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. He ran a trembling hand down the dog's back, feeling the warmth beneath the fur. Max leaned into the touch, his tail thumping faintly against the kennel wall. "You saved my life," Henry whispered, his voice thick with gratitude. "Now it's my turn to save yours." The worker smiled softly from the doorway. "Does that mean you're taking him home?" Henry turned, his hand still resting on Max's back. "Of course I am," he said firmly. "This dog isn't staying here another night." The mansion had never looked so strange to Henry as it did when he carried Max through the heavy front doors. The grand foyer, with its sweeping staircase and crystal chandelier, felt too vast, too cold. Nothing like the humble kennel where he had found the dog. Yet Max padded inside without hesitation, his paws clicking softly against the marble. "Welcome home, boy," Henry said quietly, watching as Max sniffed his way around the room. At first, the routine was awkward. Henry hadn't cared for another living being in years. The house staff, whom he had sent away for some peace, left him alone with Max. It was just the two of them, feeding, walking, cleaning. It took effort, and Henry's body often protested, but Max was patient if Henry struggled. The dog sat quietly by his side, as if reminding him it was okay to take his time. Days turned into weeks. Max's coat grew glossy, his eyes brighter. The dog began to take ownership of the mansion, curling up in the sun-drenched parlor during the afternoons, or lying by the fireplace as Henry read in the evenings. For the first time in years, laughter returned to Henry's life. Soft, genuine chuckles as Max chased a stray leaf across the polished floors or nudged his cane when it fell over. "You're making a mess of me, you know that," Henry murmured one evening as Max lay sprawled beside him, his head resting against the old man's slippered foot. The dog's tail wagged softly in response, as if to say, "Good." Henry realized that somehow the house no longer felt empty. Max filled its hollow spaces with his quiet companionship, and the cold that had long gripped Henry's heart began to thaw. He thought less of the past and more of the small moments. Max's soft breathing, the rhythmic sound of paws on hardwood, the feeling of not being alone. One morning, the snow outside was untouched, sparkling beneath a pale winter sun. Henry stood at the front door, bundled against the cold, as Max bounded eagerly across the yard, his nose buried in the fresh powder. Henry watched him for a moment before stepping carefully onto the porch, his cane steady beneath him. "Wait for me, you rascal," he called out. Max turned, his ears perked, waiting dutifully as Henry made his way down the steps. Together, they walked across the estate, the snow crunching beneath their feet. The world was silent, except for their footsteps and the occasional bark from Max as he chased a shadow or pawed at a clump of ice. When they reached the edge of the property, Henry stopped. Max came to his side, looking up at him expectantly. The old man smiled, his breath fogging the air as he reached down to scratch behind the dog's ears. "We both survived, my friend," Henry said softly, his voice carrying the weight of the life he'd lived and the gratitude for the life he still had. He looked out at the horizon where the sunlight broke over the snowy landscape and then back at Max. "And now finally we're home." Max wagged his tail, his eyes bright and knowing, as if he understood every word. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Help me grow and bring you more emotional and inspiring stories.